All right, we're in Judges chapter 7. And last week we saw how that God called Gideon to be the next judge because his people had sinned and had did evil in the sight of the Lord. And God had shared with Gideon what he needed to do, and that he was going to go defeat the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the others that were with them. They said in the chapter 6 that their camels were innumerable, and that the soldiers they had were like grasshoppers on the ground. They were just everywhere. So there was a whole pile of them. And now here in chapter 7, we're going to see how God uses Gideon to defeat the Midianites, Amalekites, and the others that were with him. And now, we've got to know and understand that under the Midianites, the Israelites had really no weapons. But, it doesn't, when God's in the mix, he's the only weapon you need. So, beginning in chapter 7, verse 1, says, Then Jerubbaal, who is Gideon, and all the people that were with him rose up early and pitched beside the well of Harod, so that the host of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. So, last week, the end of chapter 6, we saw how that he put out a fleece twice to make sure that he was doing what God wanted him to do. And now he's called all the people that were with him, and they went and they made a camp close to the Midianites. And, they were right south of the Midianites at Mount Horeb, or the hill of Moreh. And he says, And the Lord said unto Gideon, The people that are with thee are too many, for to give me the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, Mine own hand hath saved me. So he goes up with the people that had came out to go to battle the Midianites, but God says, you know what, Gideon? You've got too many. You don't need all these people. God knew the hearts of these people that were with them, but he also knew that if they went up with 32,000 soldiers, that and they defeated them, they'd be thinking, look at what I've done. It's nothing about what we've done. When we're serving God and doing the will of God, it's all about what God's doing. It's not about me. It's not about anybody else. It's all about Jesus Christ. And God knew that, so God told him, Gideon, you got too many. But now, Gideon was already somewhat afraid, but yet he was still willing to do what God wanted. So God said, Now therefore go to, proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, Whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. And there returned of the people 22,000, and there remained 10,000. So when Gideon made the announcement, hey, any of you that are afraid, you want to leave, 22,000 left. Could you imagine? You're going up against an army that you've already seen that is really innumerable. It's such a huge army. Even going against them with 32,000 would seem like, wow, you don't have enough. But when Gideon said, if any of you are afraid, 22,000 packed up and left him with 10,000 soldiers. If he wasn't scared already, do you think that might have scared him? Lord, have mercy. What are we going to do? But, as I studied this lesson and I've thought about things even going on in our world today, a lot of times we count God short. We don't think God can do something unless we've got just 1 billion people with us to help take. But you know what? If we go in the power and the will of God, all it takes is one. But so many times folks give in, and probably every one of us are guilty at times. We'll give in because we really cut God short and God's power short. But he had 22,000 men that got up and left. Lord have mercy. As I was studying, I thought about David. And I thought about when he went up against Goliath. You know, here's the whole Israelite army. Every one of them were scared to go against Goliath. But here comes David, just a ruddy little boy, probably a teenager, maybe 20. And yet he says, I'll go against him. But he said that because he was going in the power and the might of God, not his own power. And God blessed him. And you know, I've talked to several people over the past week and a half about different things, and people who are in authority, I guess you could say, and around our area. And you know, too many times we want to give in to the powers that be rather than the power of God. And that's sad, but we do. The Lord said to Gideon in verse 4, the people are yet too many. He's got 10,000 left, and God says, Gideon, you still got too many. You're going up against an army that's huge. Gideon, you got 10,000 men. You got too many. Bring them down into the water, and I will try them or test them for thee there, and it shall be that of whom I say unto thee, this shall go with thee, the same shall go with thee. And whomsoever I say unto thee, this shall not go with thee, the same shall not go. So God says, bring them down to this creek down here. Bring them down here to the water. And I'm going to put them to the test. We're going to see who is the ones that will be going with you. You know, and could you imagine being in Gideon's shoes? You know, when God called him, you know, he was threshing wheat in the valley, when really it would have been better to have been up on a hillside to thresh the wheat so that the wind would blow the chaff out of the way and you'd be left with the grain. He was down in the valley where he probably got a limited amount of wind, but at least he was going out and not afraid of those Midianites who were just wreaking havoc of the land and of the Israelite people. But when God called him, he's like, God, I'm just a poor man. I can't do this and can't do that. But you know, in the power of God, we can do anything. You know, and I think about what Jesus said in the Gospels. He said, if you just have the faith of a grain of mustard seed. And you know, the mustard like we grow today, and I love to eat mustard. I like them cooked any way you can cook them, but the best way to me is to take them and kind of cut them up. And Mama does this a lot, and she fries them. Boy, I could eat a wash tub full of them. But that little old seed that grows them mustard greens, it's one of the smallest seeds there is. And Jesus said, if you've just got the faith of a grain of mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, be moved, and it's got to go. You could say to this tree, be plucked up and out of my way, and it'd be plucked up and moved out of your way. Here's Gideon. He's got 10,000 men. God says, you got too many. You know, it took trust in Gideon. If you really look at this and look at what's going on, when God said, whoever's afraid, go ahead and go home, did he include Gideon? Gideon had been somewhat afraid, but yet he was willing to do God's will, so he didn't give in and leave. God had put the call on him. And you know what? A true called person of God, he's not going to tuck his tail and run. He's going to stand on the power of God. He's going to stand on God's word. Now, sometimes God might tell him it's time to go and move on down the road. Can't do nothing with these folks. And that's fine. But, you know, if just because somebody doesn't like you, I remember when I was ordained a preacher, a question was asked me, what if at some point somebody didn't like your preaching, what would you do? I said, well, I'm going to keep preaching because they didn't call me, God did. I don't want to give in to, I'm not going to give in to no man. Whatever God says, that's what I want to try to do to the best of my ability. That's what Gideon has done. You know, Gideon he's got to have faith. Because he didn't pack up and leave, but 22,000 did. He's left with 10,000. God says, you still got too many. Bring them down to the water, and I'm going to show you which ones to keep. I'm going to show you which ones to tell to just go on back home. But you'd think out of 10,000, you know, maybe you'd at least keep 7,000 or 8,000. But that's not going to be what happens. But God says, bring them down to the water. The ones that I tell you to keep, that's the ones you're going to keep and go with you. The ones I tell you to send home, that's the ones that are going home. They shall not go with you. So he brought down the people into the water, and the Lord said unto Gideon, everyone that lappeth up the water in his tongue, with his tongue, as a dog lappeth, him shalt thou set by himself. Likewise, everyone that boweth down upon his knees to drink. So God says, you bring them down to this water and tell them to get them something to drink. Those that kind of kneel down on one knee and gets them a handful of water and starts drinking and still looking around, he said, you set them over here by themselves. But them that just fall down on their knees and bows down in the water and drink, he said, then you put them in a group over here to themselves. And when all this happened, probably Gideon's thinking, wow, you know, this bigger group's the one I'm going to carry with me to beat these Midianites. That's surely the one, and you know, that's kind of the way we look at things. We think, oh, that bigger person is the one that's going to be the one to do the biggest battle. It's like when God called David to be king. When Samuel went to Jesse's house and he began to look at the sons of Jesse, and you know, some of them were big old fellas. And Samuel said, this has got to be the one. This is a big old rascal. He could carry the weight of this country. He could carry the weight of the people. He could go into battle. But God looked and told Samuel, said, Samuel, you're looking at the wrong thing. You're looking at the outward appearance. God said, I'm looking at the inward. I'm looking at what's in a person's heart. So here God tells Gideon, you separate these into two groups. And the number of them that lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, were 300 men. But the rest of the people bowed down their knees to drink water. So they had 9,700 that fell down on their knees and just stuck their head down in the water drinking. And they had 300. They had 300 people that did the way God said. God says, that's the 300 you're carrying with you. That's it. And the Lord said unto Gideon, by the 300 men that lapped will I save you and deliver the Midianites into thine hand, and let all the other people go, every man to his place. You know, how amazing God is. God can take something small and he can do something great with it. You know, I think about as I study this and going through it tonight, I think about how Jesus took 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread and fed 5,000 men besides the women and children. He can take something small and do something great with it. That's exactly what he was going to do here. God was going to take these 300 men and he was going to work a miracle. We serve a miracle-performing God. He can do anything. He can do the impossible. This seems totally impossible that 300 men are going to go defeat the Midianite army, the Amalekites that are with them, and the other countrymen that were with them. It seems like that's just unreal. That couldn't happen. But you know what? When God's in the situation, it can happen.
Started out with 32,000, now you're down to 300. He said, Lord, what will happen next?
He's in a mess. You know, if you look at it humanly, he's in a mess. But really, he's not. He's in the best position he could be in because God's on their side. How awesome is that? You know what? Today, God is on our side. Doesn't matter what the world says. It doesn't matter what people might think. You know, I was looking at something, I think it was yesterday, and they were talking about how that the amount of people said our country is becoming less religious. And it is. Because more and more people are rejecting God, don't want nothing to do with it. You know, here in the past, it was up above 85% that would say that, hey, you know what, I believe in God or a supreme being. Now that it's like 77%. And they said there was like 6% of the United States that say, well, I think spiritual. You know, but thinking spiritual is not going to get you to heaven. Without Jesus Christ, without living for him, without committing their lives to him, they'll never enter into heaven. So, and it's sad. But, you know, look what God has done. He's went from 32,000 down to 300. This is what you're going to carry with you, Gideon. This is what is going to, you and 300 men, so there's going to be 301 people that's going to go and defeat a huge army. And you know what? Without ever even drawing a sword. Without ever even shooting a bow and arrow or anything. They're going to defeat this army. That sounds crazy. That sounds like, you know, that could never happen. I want to tell you it can. Because we're going to see right here in just a minute. And I believe what God's Word says. So, he says in verse 8, so the people took victuals in their hand and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man into his tent, and retained those 300 men, and the host of the Median was beneath him in the valley. So he sent all of those others home. Those 300 that was left, he put trumpets in their hand and victuals in their hand, and then he sent the rest of them home. And it came to pass the same night that the Lord said unto him, arise, get thee down unto the host, for I have delivered it into thine hand. God says, Gideon, get up, get down here. You're about to conquer this huge army with 300 people.
Yeah, because he's already conquered them. All they had to do was just go down there and claim it.
All they had to be is obedient. You know, that's what God wants from us today. You know what Scripture says, obedience is better than sacrifice. And it is. If we'll do what God says, I'll tell you what God will do. He'll do exactly what his word says for us. We'll make it to heaven. We'll be with him one day. We'll live with him forever and ever. So he told Gideon to get down to the host. I've delivered them into your hand. But if thou fear to go down, go thou with Phurah, thy servant, down to the host. And thou shalt hear what they say. And afterward shall thine hands be strengthened to go down into the host. Then went he down with Phurah, his servant, unto the outside of the armed men that were in the host. So the Midianite army that was camped out, God told him, you get down there, you're going to hear what they're talking about. And you know, God's going to use them to share with Gideon what's about to happen. But God says, Gideon, if you're still a little afraid, take your servant Phurah, ever how you want to pronounce it, down with you. So he was still a little afraid because he took him with him. And he went down. But how many of us would not be afraid? Going up against a huge army with 300 people. You think you might have a little doubt in your mind? Do you think it? But if we know without a doubt God's with us, we shouldn't doubt. We should have faith enough. God, I know you're coming through. God, you're going to accomplish exactly what you said. You're going to deliver them into our hand, and that's what's going to happen. So he went down. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the children of the east lay along the valley like grasshoppers for multitude. And their camels were without number as the sand by the seaside for multitude. So, again, God's sharing with them, look how big this army is you're going against. But don't be afraid. I'm with you. I'm going to deliver them into your hand. And when Gideon was come, behold, there was a man that told a dream unto his fellow, and said, Behold, I dreamed a dream, and lo, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the host of the Midian, and came unto a tent, and it smote it that it fell, and overturned it, and the tent lay along. And his fellow answered and said, This is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel, for unto his hand hath God delivered Midian and all the host. So look at what God's using these two men laying there, woke up out of a dream. Hey, you know what? I had a dream. This cake, this cornbread come rolling in. And it knocked down a tent. And the other one said, you know what? That was the hand of Gideon. That was the sword of Gideon. And God's going to deliver us into his hand. What more reassurance could God have given to Gideon? You're about to defeat a huge army that's laid out here like grasshoppers for multitude. Innumerable. But he's only got 300 folks. And it was so, when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and the interpretation thereof, that he worshipped and returned into the host of Israel, and said, Arise, for the Lord hath delivered into your hand the host of Midian. But see what Gideon did right to begin with? When he heard that interpretation of that dream, what did he do? He worshiped God right then and there. He was praising God. God, I know you're going to do exactly what you say. So he went down, he got everybody up. Hey, God's fixing to deliver them into your hand. And he divided the 300 men into 3 companies. And he put a trumpet in every man's hand with empty pitchers and lamps within the pitchers. This is all they've got, is a trumpet, a pitcher, and a lamp inside of that pitcher. That's their weapons. But they have the best weapon. They have God. We look at weapons today. We talk about nuclear weapons and how powerful they are, and they're powerful. One of the most powerful weapons in the world today is a nuclear weapon. But you know what? If we got God on our side, that doesn't even hold a candle to what God can do. God is awesome. So he divided them up into 3 companies. And he said unto them, Look on me, and do likewise. And behold, when I come to the outside of the camp, it shall be that as I do, so shall ye do. So he's giving them instructions. You watch me. Whatever I do, that's what you're going to do. Because God is going to deliver these people into our hands. God's going to take care of it. God's already defeated them for us. So he says, when I blow with a trumpet, I and all that are with me, then blow ye the trumpets also on every side of all the camp, and say, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. That's their battle cry. The sword of the Lord and of Gideon. That's what they've got to holler out. Because God has taken care of it. God is going to bless them tremendously this night. God is going to do exactly what he said. And you know, we serve the same God. He's going to do exactly what he says. Regardless of what the world says. Regardless of what people might say. And, you know, I read some things today that some people were talking about and sharing. And they said, you know, folks have got to come to the realization that things have changed. And, you know, people have changed. But you know what? God hasn't changed. He's still the same God. What was a sin in the beginning is still a sin. And you know what? It'll still be a sin in the end. And what's an abomination to God now will be an abomination. It's been an abomination throughout all time. And that's sin. A lot of times folks just want to pick out one particular sin. But if you read Scripture, you'll find that all sin is an abomination to God because God hates sin. So Gideon told them what to do. And then in verse 19, so Gideon and the 100 men that were with him came unto the outside of the camp in the beginning of the middle watch. And they that had newly set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers that were in their hands. And the 3 companies blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers and held the lamps in their hands and the trumpets in their right hands to blow withal. And they cried, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Could you imagine being woke up out of sleep, hearing something breaking and crashing to the ground, and then seeing lights and hearing trumpets blow? That probably startled you. That probably scared the socks off of you.
Especially when they were surrounded.
And they're surrounded. But God's going to use that light to help destroy the evil. Because what does light do? Light will do away with evil. So they had done what Gideon had told them, and they cried out, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And they stood every man in his place round about the camp, and all the host ran and cried and fled. It scared them to death. They're pulling swords and they're killing one another. They're so scared. They don't realize what's going on, but you know what? God's got his hand on all this. God has brought all of this about. God's told Gideon what to do, and if he'll do that, God says, I'm going to deliver these folks into your hands. And look what it says, with these 300 men, they stood their ground. And you know what? That's what we have to do today. When the enemy comes against us, we have to stand our ground. We can't give up. We can't back up. You know, Paul shared in Ephesians chapter 6, when you've done everything you can do, stand. He didn't say give in. He didn't say back up. He said stand. These men, what did those 300 do? When they break the pitchers, blow the trumpets, and they stood every man in his place around about the camp. They didn't move. They didn't back up. You talk about the hand of God on somebody. You know, if we'll take a stand for God, I want to tell you, He's right there with us. He'll never leave us nor forsake us. And the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow. So God said, I'm going to deliver them into your hand. They're doing away with one another. Even throughout all the hosts, and the host fled to Beth-shittah in Zerath, and to the border of Abel-meholah, unto Tabitha. And the men of Israel gathered themselves together out of Nephtali, and out of Asher, and out of all of Manasseh, and pursued after the Midianites. So those that were left, that managed to get away, they're running, and now you've got more Israelites that come in behind them that are going to destroy them. So how awesome is God? Gideon sent messengers throughout all Mount Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites, and take before them the waters unto Beth-barah and Jordan. Then all the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together and took the waters of Beth-barah and Jordan. So, you know, they did exactly what God said. God delivered this huge army into their hands. This huge army was destroying itself. They were so scared about what was taking off. You know, you're in the dark. And all of a sudden you hear pitchers breaking and trumpets blowing. And then all of a sudden lights all around you. That's enough to scare you to death. That's what happened. It scared them to death. They were killing one another. They didn't know what the world was going on. And Gideon sent, and he's told other Israelites to come down and take those Midianites. And they took 2 princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeeb. And they slew Oreb upon the rock Oreb. And Zeeb they slew at the winepress of Zeeb, and pursued Midian, and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeeb to Gideon on the other side of Jordan. So, you know, God did exactly what He told him that He would do. He took these people. He said, Gideon, if you'll go with what I tell you to do. He starts out with 32,000 men. He gets down to 10,000. God says, you still got too many. He gets down to 300. God says, if you follow my instructions, I'm going to give them into your hand. And when they did what God said, God delivered them into His hand. And here's 2 of the princes of the Midianites, that their heads were basically brought on a platter to Gideon, showing him that they were gone. They were dead. You know, God was doing exactly what He told him He'd do. But, you know, they're like folks today, like we are. Sometimes we don't learn real fast. And, you know, we're going to read more about Gideon next week, but, you know, they're eventually, when Gideon dies, what's going to happen? They're going to fall away again. So, and that's sad. We know what God can do. We know what lays ahead for us in heaven. But yet sometimes we get hard-headed and we do things contrary to what God would have us to do. But you know what? I'm thankful we serve such a God that if we'll turn to Him, He'll hear our cries, He'll forgive us, and we can keep walking with Him. Really, the Scripture proves that out. Because time and time again, when they fell away, when they cried out to God, God restored them. I read I believe it's Psalms chapter 51, where David told God, God, just restore unto me the joy of my salvation. You know, God will restore us if we fall away, if we get away from Him and we, God, Lord, I've sinned, I've done something wrong, forgive me. God forgives us and we can keep going with Him. That's an awesome God. And He tells us we can go with Him all the way to heaven. All we have to do is keep our eyes on Him, keep our hearts sold out to Him. That's all it takes. Gideon obeyed God, and look what God did. This huge army was defeated by 301 Israelites. Anybody have any questions or comments on any of this chapter or anything in Scripture?